Welcome back, MTG Joe here. We're here for another installment of the weekly meta breakdown where we look at the top performing decks on the MTG Arena ladder. This video will be for standard best of one. We'll cover all the formats that we can this week, and we'll put out the videos for them. There was kind of a content announcement I did put out in the community tab. I'm going to be shifting a little bit away from kind of the gameplay videos in terms of pushing for high rank. From a timing perspective, I just don't get as many hours in a day to kind of grind the arena ladder. Instead, I'm going to focus more on obviously the meta content, but we put out, like, say, for example, the mono red aggro sideboard guide. So I'm going to be doing more sideboard guides, or we'll start with standard and then branch out once we get to some of the eternal formats. So putting out more like resources in that sense to kind of be a one-stop shop. So won't be any paywall to get like sideboard guides, anything like that, putting it out for the community. If there is other type of content that's like kind of non-gameplay, let me know. And then I think for the gameplay, what I'm going to be focusing on more is, so for example, yesterday's video was Gruul Bard class and Historic. So looking at a deck that got some new things, seeing if it's viable in the new format, as opposed to just jamming the best deck and kind of seeing how that goes. So demoing, showcasing kind of off the beaten path, try to give you some variety and see if things are kind of combating the meta in a certain way. So let me know what you think in the comments about that kind of approach, but we'll jump into the meta video for today. As always, we get the data from Untapped, aggregates your win rate with other users. There's a cool bunch of stats. The link is in the video description. As always, I'll paste the deck list in the video description so you can copy paste. We're going to start off looking at meta popularity, and because it's the first week of October, people got reset to platinum. So usually the first video of the week, I do like to keep it at platinum rank. And then as we progress through the month, we'll go to mythic rank. Again, ignore the May 30th. We're just looking at popularity of the day. And mono red continues to be the most popular deck, 20.7, 21%. Usually see a spike at the beginning of every month. And we see that kind of correlate here where we're at 19%. We went as high as 24. And now we're seeing it start to normalize as more folks kind of progress up the ranks. Mono white humans, another good choice in terms of an aggressive deck for the format. We see Golgari mid-range at about 8%, 4-color control, which is your domain kind of control deck, ramp decks. At 4, Selesnya at 4, Gruul Aggro, kind of a newer feature here at 3.3, mono blue tempo, which is a very budget-friendly deck, 3%, and then mono white control, which is usually like the mono white mid-range planeswalker decks at 2.7%. So again, we're seeing a pretty big jump in the humans deck where leading up it was about 8%, and now we're seeing it in the double digits at 13. Really not too many big drops, like the Selesnya Enchantments deck is kind of falling out of favor in the low 4s. We're seeing Gruul Aggro kind of come up, where if we look at from last month, 1%, and now it's technically 400% more popular at 4%. So we're going to jump in, and the nice thing about looking at platinum, we have 220,000 game sample size from October 2nd to October 9th. So really good kind of sample of games to look at. And we're going to just start things off with Orzhov mid-range. So this is at 63.6%. And this is an interesting way to kind of combat the meta. We see a lot of folks being on more linear aggressive decks. And this deck here will give you access to like Lay Down Arms, as well as Ossification as cheap removal. Ambitious Farmhand and Spirit Companion are cards that provide card advantage in a way, but can also be used as early blockers. A card that's seeing some play in this deck is Investigator's Journal, Bankbuster at Home, to provide some card draw. Celestis, Restoration, ways to kind of ramp you ahead. The Restoration can also rebuy Ambitious Farmhands and Spirited Companions. 4 wedding announcements, good way to block the game early. You have your Planeswalker package, Archangel, Wandering Emperor, Eternal Wanderer. Sarah Paragon lets you recast some of your smaller stuff. Some copies of The End, a nice way to deal with like a Shieldred or a common threat. Like even if just hitting an Adeline, taking away all the Adelines is also really nice. We have a Virtue of Loyalty that can surprise block early, some Sunfalls, and a Farewell as a sweeper, and then Breach the Multiverse on the top end. I do think this version, given the popularity of some of the decks, because the thing is, we'll see the next deck being mono white, they do play Thalia, so taxing some of your non-creature spells. I really think in this format, playing like the third Sunfall might be beneficial. Like Breach the Multiverse isn't going to give you a huge amount of value against like mono red. Like paying 7 mana to get a Swiss Spear, it's not the best. The Breach the Multiverse is more of a best of 3 card when you're trying to hit things like Atraxa and stuff like that. If you do run into a lot of Domain, then it's a reasonable choice to kind of bring it in. But I don't think it's unreasonable to trim like the Breaches and maybe even playing like a Virtue Sunfall. You can bring up the number of restorations in there. You can just play like the full Ossification set. I think all are really reasonable choices to kind of approach it. Mirrex in the mana base as well as another win condition. From there, we go to mono white at 63.4. And we see kind of some adaptation with the Extraction Specialist. Just a nice card here in the heavy removal matchups, even against mono red, because they are going to be main boarding, 8+ removal spells plus adversary to flash back. So this not only provides you a life linker, but rebuys some of your creatures. Really good if you throw something like the Sorcerer token on, or Sorcerer Aura from Spellbook Vendor on it, just getting you 4 life returns pretty big. You have your Intrepid Adversaries, as mentioned, like the Thalia attacks. Copper Coat plays really nicely with these, just increasing power. Adelins, and then a single copy of Knight Errant. So one thing with this deck, it's built to kind of combat these more creature mirrors, which you're seeing in terms of percentages of games, which is good. If there is a shift and you are encountering a larger number of board white based decks, going up the number of Knight Errant is not the worst idea. Just giving you some card advantage in that form. This version's also on the 3 Mishra's Foundry. So the one thing we're seeing with this mana base in the mono white deck is it's kind of mirroring what a lot of the mono red decks have been doing, where they're playing 2 Sokazans and 3 Mishra's Foundries. I think the 3 Mishra's Foundry is less painful in this deck as opposed to the mono red deck, because mono red deck tends to be lower on the curve and you want a double red spell oftentimes on turn 2. Where if you look on this, all your turn 2 plays are not reliant on having double white. And you're not too often double whiting on turn 1 necessarily. We then go to Selesnya Enchantments at 62%. Not too much innovation here. We're still seeing the full 4 Calyx. We're seeing the Catildas in here as a 2 of. Given the prevalence of mono red, it might just be right to maybe drop Mashikos and just play full set of Catildas, just being a big beater. The Borrowed Time in here to exile artifact. Well, this one targets all non-land permanents. The one that has Ward, I forget its name right now. While it's narrower in terms of the scope, I do think the Ward's beneficial at times. But again, I think it's kind of situational in terms of what you're running into. This is easier to cast, being just 2 and a white as opposed to 1 white. So that could be a consideration in terms of the mana base. Because you're on Ossification, you do have to stretch your mana a bit in terms of playing a higher number of basics in the mana base. Those Gives welcomes a nice card in this deck, just providing you some card advantage whenever your creature's enter the battlefield. Good again against like heavier removal decks. This deck oftentimes can drop its initial hand, but then outside of Spirited Companion, you're not getting too much card advantage beyond that. So you're a little reliant on that type of effect. We'll head over to 4 color control. So this is Reduke's version from the Pro Tour. Beans, the hottest card in Eternal formats right now. Rewarding you for casting bigger mana spells. The briefcases help you ramp early along with Topiary Stomper. This version of the deck is a little bit more susceptible to the more aggressive decks in the sense that you have the Go for the Throat and the Virtues. While you can align the Leyline Bindings early through like dropping like a Spar's Headquarter on 1, Zeotora's on 2, you don't always have your removal on 2. The Virtue does help by gaining you a little bit of life, but you're really trying to rely on your Archangels and Sunfalls to carry in the aggressive matchups. Obviously, once you can hit something like Atraxa, you're golden against a lot of those decks. Especially with like mono white, they're pretty much. Oh, that was an accident. The mono white deck is completely off of the Brutal Cathars. So while Brutal Cathar is not a great deck card against like ramp because you get the Atraxa back, it can kind of blink them in a sense to give you access to have like an attack in your top end. You're also incidentally gaining life from Herd Migration. This is a good top end, but your core of the deck, ramp, play big fatty, Smork, you can kind of go to town. See the mono blue tempo at 61%. This deck is fairly budget. This version's actually, fully spending all your rare wild cards. So usually it's only 4 rare wild cards. This version's on 2 Hornlock Whales, which I think is a nice welcome addition. Plays really into the theme of the deck. Tempoing just in terms of bouncing attackers early. And then late game gives you a flash threat that you can hold up mana. Core of the deck is to play a bunch of cheap instants and sorceries. Ideally get a Tolarian Terror for 1 mana. And then get a really big Wadijin that also then reduces your other spells. We're seeing Make Disappears, Moment of Truth, Spell Pierces in here, Sleight of Hands, Fading Hope. So interesting selection, bunch of 3-ofs. Can I tell you why one's a 3-of versus a 4-of? Couldn't. I kind of avoid these decks. I don't really enjoy playing them. This deck can somewhat stonewall like mono red at times, but it's very easy for mono red to also get under it. Because once they start getting, like outside of the Fading Hope, they don't really respond too well. So the Hornlock Whale might be that kind of consideration to get under those decks as well. One card that you might want to consider is the 2 mana counter target spell that's 2 CMC or less, or a red or green spell up to 6. That could be a consideration because it hits a lot of mono whites threats as well. And it might be something useful in the sense, but I would have to see like the frequency in terms of how you're playing it. We then go to the Gruul Aggro 59%, and this is kind of a modified sub-theme. So smashing red cards that are good, Kumanos, Monstrous Rage, Swiftspear, Feldon, Squee Godric with green cards. So you see that you're playing a full Plaza of Heroes package for the Legends. So Halana and Alana, Miglos, Samut provides card advantage. You have a Ruby, which also helps you ramp into your bigger cards. It makes you double spell as well, and then gets a bonus later game. Hajar's protection as well. Lots of ways to kind of smack into your opponent with this deck. You have Animus Might, 3 mana. This spell costs 2 less if it targets a legendary creature, and then deals damage to twice that creature's power. So this is a nice way to kind of deal with the Shieldred, stuff of that nature. 1 mana is pretty cheap. Now, notably, this is sorcery speed, so you can't really do it like tricky style, but it is a nice way to kind of deal with some of the bigger creatures. And notably, it's deals damage, not fights, which against Shieldred, even if you're winning the fight, you're losing the fight because of Death Touch. I really like Samut. I think this card's really cool. The one downside with this deck is a lot of your bigger spells get hit by Cut Down. Samut, Halana and Alana. Thankfully, like Miglos and Godric get saved, but outside of that, like Hajar gets saved, but everything else kind of gets hit. So you might want to just be cautious in terms of like curving into like cut downs, because you don't want your 3-4 mana spells to get hit by a 1 mana spell. Tempo negative. Then go to Golgari mid-range, so 59% win rate. So this version here got some interesting inclusions. You see 2 Iron Craigs as a way to kind of ramp up in the deck, featuring a really nice removal package. So cut downs, go for the throats, and moving a little bit away from it's basically the mono black mid-range deck, but with green cards that are really good. Mosswood Dread Knight gives you card advantage, a really kind of sticky body that keeps coming back. Glissa obviously wins most combats, and it makes like blocking really awkward. Card advantage, blows up enchantments, leyline bindings, ossifications, anything of that nature. Trespassers for graveyard hate, life gain, some Lilianas. I think in best of 1, 2 Lilianas is that sweet spot. Well, you're going to run into the occasional control deck. In most games against like these creature decks, it's just a -2 and then soak up some damage. Versions on a bigger kind of 4-drop package. Arcfiend Ladros quickly can close out games, gains you some life, drains some life out of your opponent as well. Shieldred, obviously this card is really good. And then we see a Ashiok for some card advantage, makes you some bunch of tokens. Dix Command as a sweeper, Shieldred as another kind of sack effect, nice mana sink late, and then obviously the Virtue is very powerful in that respect. Honestly, like you're probably just worthwhile playing the full set of Virtues. With the meta, we're seeing like 35% of the meta being like low to the ground aggro decks. That I think that's a totally reasonable approach to the meta. And then Restless Cottage, so good, such a good creature land. Finally, aforementioned mono red. So the thing is, I did go to Diamond to Mythic rank on this one because the one that people were playing in Platinum was fairly dated, and I don't think it's the best version of the deck. So I don't want to really steer folks in that case. So like I mentioned, a lot of the decks now are playing 3 Mishra's Foundry. I'm still on the fence with it, and in the best of 3 version, I've been going back and forth with how I'm adapting the mana base. I do like the 2 Sokuzans. I think you're very seldomly going to get punished on the 2 Sokuzans, and just having the availability to channel is pretty good. In best of 1, I do like having the 2 Feldons. In best of 3, I've gone down to 1 because the meta tends to be more Esper based, which has white and black removal as opposed to red, like damage based removal. Whereas in standard, like Feldon's one of the best cards in the mirror because it's basically reads this card is pretty much unblockable, or you're providing your opponent with a lot of card advantage. I do like having the Nahiri's Warcrafting main. The Squeeze and Godric's are nice. I think the only thing that I would maybe experiment with is cutting a Squee in favor of a Bloodthirsty. I think having the full set is beneficial in these matchups just to rebuy cards. While Squee's very good, it can get kind of in the mirrors. It's useful, but against like mono white and stuff like that, it's not the best card. Again, in best of 1, like I would only play like 2 Phoenix Chicks. And go to Esper Legends. So this is the World's Champions list. No, this is not. I lie. This is an older kind of style. Adelin's probably better than Lord Skitter in best of 1. Given that its vigilance goes wide, the tokens can block, I think are all beneficial. Adelin can brick wall a lot of times the mono red decks, which is useful. I think Lauren's reasonable with the ossifications, enchantments, stuff of that nature. Plays nicely to kind of force draw with Shieldred as well. The Ronas are fine, I think, in the numbers. 3 go for the throat, stuff of that nature. AO in best of 1 is probably fine. In best of 3, given that there's more like exile-based removal, Wandering Emperor, stuff of that nature, I'd probably trim that. But the curves of like Skrelv into Denic into Rafine, or Skrelv, Thalia, Rafine, really powerful in this format. This version's on 28 lands. Usually you see 27 to 28. Taking advantage of all these utility lands, the channel lands, as basically spells for 1 mana in the deck. Then lastly, we have Rakdos Aggro, kind of Rakdos Steal and Sack. So you have the Twisted Fealties that can steal things and then either sack it to Mokotai Soul Ripper or to Braids at the end step, which is really nice. Callous Well Stored can also sack a creature and deal damage to its power to target, like basically like Fling type of effect. I don't know why Fling was so hard on the mind. Hopeless Nightmare is really nice. Hand Hate, or like just discard, lose some life, sack the Braids for more value. Monstrous Rage, notably you can both have the big creature, sack it, but then also just sack the roll token to Braids to force the enchantment sack. I believe this is Croaky's list, but kind of a cool deck, all things considered, at 57%. That's it for the week. Let me know what you think. There was a pretty major historic nerf announcement that also impacts Alchemy, so definitely check that out if you're still playing those formats. If you enjoy them, I think for historic's really good. Alchemy hopefully will change things up as well, especially with the new drop coming out. In any case, thanks for watching. Hope you have a great one and stay safe.